Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a short video I wanted to bring to you this evening. I hope you're all doing well. I hope everybody is fine, and I hope everybody has got through their week in one piece. I most certainly have. I'm feeling quite upbeat and quite healthy today, which is nice. So having got a few things done and spoken to a few people, loved ones like my parents and my girlfriend, I thought I would just nip out, make use of the lovely sunshine and do a quick video because there are a couple of things on my mind. Although I wouldn't advocate necessarily watching television, I do sometimes do so because it keeps me a little bit informed in terms of not information per se, i.e. genning myself up on an educational level, but it certainly reminds me of the nonsense and reminds me, like that we needed any reminding, of the illusions that are placed before us, etc. In terms of hyping certain stories up or just basically inventing them, and such like. I'm not going to ramble on about that. But anyway, one of the major things going on at the moment, and it begins this evening, are the Olympic Games. The opening ceremony is this evening in Paris, and of course the media are all over it. Obviously, it's a big event. It gets beamed all across the world, and there's politics connected to it. There's big money obviously connected with it, in terms of sponsorship deals and such like, but it also gives you a platform to basically create your narratives on, because you're going to get a massive audience who will listen and notice what you're saying. So today, for example, and I'm going to tell you a little story in a minute, so bear with me, but today, for example, there's the narrative that some train lines going into Paris have been sabotaged by, well, they don't know who, but they've already given a little short list of 3 possibilities to prevent trains from getting to Paris. Actually, it's not much of a sabotage at all. When you listen to exactly what's supposed to have happened, not much has been really disrupted, but it makes for good stories. And the 3 suspects, in their eyes, the eyes of the media, or let's say the eyes of the powers that hand it down to the media for them to proclaim to the rest of us, are jihadists, Russians, or leftists. They're your 3 groups that have been given to us. I find it really funny because it's literally within an hour of the sabotage events allegedly having taken place, and it reminds us, well, some of us at least, very much of other events that have happened in the past, where it doesn't take long for the creators of these narratives to then suddenly offer a short list of who it can be, who it shall be, and thus etching it into the minds of those listening on, so that you got nowhere else to go with your thoughts except that, in terms of who it allegedly is. I just found that quite interesting. There is a 4th option to who it may be, of course. I won't go into that now, but those of you with a bit of an inquisitive mind who like to question things and use their discernment will know exactly what I'm talking about. Look at that horizon over there, by the way. Over there in the distance is the Isle of Wight, and that is a place that, thanks mate, that is a place that I did a observational video on a couple of years ago, and today, from a very high elevation, because I'm on the top of a cliff, you cannot actually see the slither of land that I managed to see last time from 1 foot elevation. right? Which proves the point that I often say to people when they come out with this nonsense about, well, why can't you see Ireland from New York if the earth is flat? Well, you can't, because there's a lot of shit in the air half the time. And depending on what sort of day it is, you know, you'll have different levels of pollution in the air, and sometimes you can see very far and sometimes you can't see very far in terms of your view through the air, the clarity of that which you are looking through. So today is a lovely sunny day, but clearly it's too hazy for you to even see half of the Isle of Wight over there in the very distance, whereas on my observational video that I did, I could see a sliver of land coming out to the right into the ocean, if you like, that, having googled it straight afterwards on Google Maps, was 27, or is still, because it's still there, 27 miles away from a 1 foot elevation through epoxy camera on my phone. Right, so that kind of proves the point why you can't see ultra long distances even on a clear or what appears to be a clear and sunny day, because you do have stuff in the air that's not visible to the naked eye but does impair your long distance viewing capabilities in terms of clarity. You know, I mean, the other stuff that gets in the way will be things like angular resolution, because it's perspectives, and you have a vanishing point at some point where you can't see any further. It's that simple. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent there. So getting back to the Olympics. So, yeah, and the opening ceremony today reminded me of something that it just put my mind straight back to 2008. And I'll tell you a little story. In 2008, I was with my wife at the time and her cousin, and we travelled to the Republic of Georgia to visit her family, and so we did. And they live in a town on the Black Sea called Porti. It's allegedly an old Greek trading town. Flat roofed architecture, if you like, well, triangular, but very flat triangular roofed, and pillars on the houses and stuff like that, blah blah blah. Anyway, on this said evening, it was the 8th of August 2008, we were settling down in their living room watching the television after a nice day, and we were drinking some local Georgian red wine when suddenly the house that we were in started to shudder, and we could hear noises outside, and they sounded distant noises, but noises nevertheless, and they were kind of reminiscent of explosive devices and that sort of thing. Now you could ask me, well, how would you know what explosive devices sound like? Well, because I grew up in a military environment, and we used to live quite near to exercise areas and ranges and stuff like that, and you would hear the military all the time testing ammunition and practicing and stuff, so you get accustomed to certain sounds and noises, and you can hear then straight away, you can identify what they are, whether they're a car backfiring or whether they are indeed thunder flashes, as they're called, or the like, you know. So we were sat there that evening, we were hearing these noises, and then the house started shuddering a bit, and then the lights went down, and then suddenly the TV, you know, we had no connection anymore, no transmission to the programs that we were watching, and we were all ushered out of the house. So we got out of the house, went down the stairs, went out into the street. This was at night, this was dark o'clock. And, you know, I don't speak a word of Georgian, well, a few words, but I certainly can't piece together a sentence. And, you know, there was a lot of hectic, and loads of neighbours were running around, and the men were running around in their shorts and open shirts, sort of all yelling at each other and stuff. And then in the background, in the distance, I could hear lots of gunfire. It's like people were grabbing their AK-47, just shooting them in the sky. This is a country who a few years beforehand had a bit of a civil war and a revolution, I'll say it with a small R. So a lot of families still had guns at home. It was a done thing. There was nothing unusual about it. And in fact, some of the bars we went to, a lot of the signage in the entrances of the bars that we went into had no guns signage on the front of it, you know, just like you would have no smoking here, for example. But anyway, getting back to the story, and it became apparent that there was a bit of an issue going on, and you know, there had been an issue with Russia, the big neighbour, for years coming up to this moment. And in fact, a few months leading up to our visit to Georgia, we did have contingency plans in place. Should anything go down, we agreed that we would head south and go along the Black Sea and get over the Turkish border ASP, because Turkey is signed up to what they call the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. So then once you're on their soil, as it were, certainly from an administrative point of view, you're safe. Because an attack on a single NATO nation means an attack on the whole of NATO, which means you would drag all NATO nations into the conflict by doing that. And the Russians, of course, wouldn't do that. Now, that is all mainstream chat, what I'm giving you there, but that's how it works on the official level. So that evening, we were all gathered out in the streets and people running around like headless chickens, and there was lots of gunfire in the air, but that was it. That's all we heard was locals shooting up in the air. We didn't hear any bombing or anything like that. We weren't getting bombed to smithereens by the Russian Air Force or anything like that, but we were allegedly under attack. The country had allegedly been invaded by Russian forces. So the story went on that we ended up hanging around the house for the rest of the night, and I drank a lot of red wine. So did my wife's cousin. My wife at the time wasn't really much of a drinker, but I was, and her cousin certainly joined me in that venture, and we drank loads of this stuff and didn't get drunk at all because the adrenaline quite literally took over. To cut a very, very long story short, we didn't sleep that night at all. In fact, we made it to the Saturday morning, by which time I was phoning around embassies to try and find out who would help us get out of the country. Because the three of us had 3 different passports. I had a British one, my wife at the time had a Georgian one, and her cousin had a German one. You couldn't get help for all 3 from any single embassy. So the British embassy would help me, but not the other 2, etc., etc. You get my drift. So we were basically left to our own devices to get the hell out of Dodge. And eventually, the long and short of it is that the local villagers managed to get enough petrol together in a minibus, and they basically got us together, put us in the back of this minibus, and we left the village with screeching wheels and headed to the Black Sea coast. The town that we were in is on the coast anyway, but we headed onto the coastal road and went then thus west towards the Turkish border, which is about a 3-hour drive away. Now, according to the news sources that we were following the night previously, because the TV began to work again later and electricity was restored, etc., etc., they were telling us that the Black Sea flotilla were on their way to the Georgian coast, the Russian Black Sea flotilla, with all their navy ships and all that sort of nonsense. So, of course, you'd be expected to see all that when you're driving along the coastal roast in the north of Turkey. We didn't see anything. We didn't see any navy or anything like that on the way to the Turkish border or anything of the sort. In fact, and here's the key bit, we didn't see or witness any fighting at all. No fighting at all. Saw no Russian tanks, saw no Georgian tanks for that matter. And we went past a few army bases, because there are some Western army bases in Georgia, there were at the time, because a lot of Georgian soldiers were being trained up by Western military experts. So they did have their military hubs, but we definitely saw no fighting. And yet in the news, they were portraying the country to be almost sort of in flames, and portraying it to be a country under siege, and portraying the Russian troops as being that of sort of Viking-style hooligans who were rampaging and pillaging and raping their way through Georgian towns and cities and eating kids and such like. Well, none of that was going on. Absolutely none of it. But the news were telling us that. So you could be quite literally sat in a house in Georgia, and the news on your TV would be telling you that the very country you're in, where you're watching the news, is quite literally in flames. And because you're taking the news for gospel and not paying attention to what's going on out through the window, that is what you're basing your knowledge on, and subsequently your actions, in our case, getting the hell out of the country. So that is, of course, what happened. And so we were paying attention to that, and wrongly paying attention to that, because, of course, many months later we found out we never should have fled the country the way we did. We didn't have to. In fact, the family was safe and they were never in danger ever. But the story goes on that having found this minibus and got out of the town and we headed along the Black Sea coast, we ended up getting to the crossover point where we then needed to find a taxi at the border. But before we could do that, we had to get over the border into Turkey. I ended up having to pay for a visa to be able to cross the border. And the others, that's my ex-wife and her cousin, they eventually also managed to get over the border. In fact, it was my ex-wife with her Georgian passport that had the biggest difficulties. I mean, they almost invited me over the border with my British passport, and the same went for the cousin. She, with her German passport, was very welcomed into Turkey too. But all three of us managed to get over the border into Turkey eventually, and that was that. And that was the end of us having to sit around in Georgia worrying whether we were going to get bombed, pillaged, and whatever else nasty things that Russian people get up to. Now, the reason why I'm telling you this story is because while all that was going on, there was an Olympic opening ceremony that Friday night. And I recall one of the last pictures I saw on the TV before we were ushered out the house was President Putin in the stadium clapping Georgian athletes as they were being brought into the stadium. I don't know why this guy has suddenly stopped in there. I'm pointing the camera at the sea, mate. I'm not even looking at you. Well, I did because you stood staring at me, so I went like that, yeah. No need to, mate. I went like that. Yeah, well, you were looking at me, so yeah, I went like that. Anyway, this is what's going on the whole time. People stood looking at me like I've got, I don't know, something weird coming out my ears. No idea what's going on. And now he's stopped in the bay over there and he's going to be hanging around. Anyway, so I'll walk up this road. See, this is what happens to me often when I go out. Don't know what it is. I have my suspicions, but I'm not going to out them here. But I find it eerie, most certainly. Yeah, so getting back to the story. So I remember Putin clapping as the Georgian athletes were coming into the stadium in Beijing. This was in 2008. You know, the irony of that, while allegedly Georgia, the country that he was clapping as they were marching in, was getting bombed by his air force, according to the mainstream narrative, right? So, you know, knowing that in terms of what was going on, see yet another car. I mean, it's quite unbelievable. No matter where I stand, there's a car that needs to park right where I'm stood, or needs to turn into an entry where I'm stood. Seriously, this has been happening the whole time. This is why it's taken so long for me to film this, because I wanted to do this about an hour ago, but I kept on wondering what the hell was going on. That's why I didn't. So I just felt followed the whole time. I felt watched. I felt followed. You know, it's just bizarre. I don't know. I can't put my finger on it. I don't know. Can't explain it. I swear, honestly, I'm not hallucinating. I've not taken anything dodgy or anything like that. I've not smoked any decent pot or weed or anything. It's just, it's incredible. And now the guy who you went like that and sat over there at that bay where that white van is, has now gone. So I've moved out of his view and now he's buggered off, no longer of interest to him. It's just bizarre. Call me a conspiracy theorist, but it is bizarre. Anyway, we're looking over the bay there, Bournemouth to the right there, and the pier. I don't know if you can see it very well through my camera. Yeah, so the reason why I'm saying this, and one of the reasons why I mention it in this story, is also it ties in well with the whole Ukraine thing, and how, you know, I've had people say to me, well, how could you possibly not have a war in a place people living there would know? Well, no, they wouldn't. No, they wouldn't. Just because you hear something going bang and pop in the background miles away, Doesn't mean to say you know exactly what's going on there. Doesn't mean that at all. And there are very, very, very few people you will come across who will actually say that they personally witnessed something horrific. You find that the people who they drag in front of the cameras will be either crisis actors, or there'll be people so shaken up and scared that they'll tell you the story you want to hear because they've seen it on the news. And you can create and generate that angst and that fear through media overload. And that gets people to behave in a certain way. It just does. That was my experience in Georgia in 2008, and I'm sure many people experience in Ukraine as well. A similar thing. And a similar thing in Israel and Palestine. Right? So unless you've actually witnessed that and been in a situation where you've been told one thing where in actual fact, if you look carefully, that's not really going on, though you're giving the impression it is, then you don't know what you're talking about. You know, so people who have an opinion on these sorts of subjects, who then use that opinion to counter-argue my points, having been through a similar sort of situation, I'm afraid they're barking up the wrong tree, because they have no proofs or evidence or personal experience to build their arguments on, but I do. What a gorgeous day. It's supposed to get warmer now over the next few days as well. So, you know, I'll see if it's not too hot. I might venture out over the next few days. Some gorgeous apartments here as well on the seafront. These are all old buildings, all of them. Gorgeous. And in the distance there, the end of this road is Boscombe. And if you follow the road right round to the end there, you're going past Southbourne, and then you're heading towards Hengstbury Head. To the right of that bit of land sticking out there that looks all beige and brown, that's Hengstbury Head. And then beyond that, you'll be going to places like Christchurch and stuff like that. Yeah. So there you go. And I'm tying that in with the Olympics because that is something that's starting today, the opening ceremony. And every time I hear of opening ceremonies, it reminds me very much of my escapades in, in Georgia, and the time I was over there when they were doing the Olympic opening ceremony. We were watching it on the TV while the very country I was sat in, was allegedly being bombed to smithereens. And of course, looking back at it now and all that, and seeing things the way I do now, that wasn't the case at all. But it was the narrative we were fed all along. Speaking of narratives, did you know that the Olympic Games in the modern era, and this is how they say to qualify it, was founded in 1894 by a French historian, and the first games were 1896. And isn't it interesting? It's another thing that we talk about a lot amongst those who research the old world and historical stuff correctly. We say it a lot, that a lot of sporting things that are a thing today, like football and cricket and golf and you name it, pick any country, pick any sport, were all invented or find their roots back in the 19th century, the 1800s, not earlier than that. Now, the Olympics, according to the narrative, of course, have their roots back in old Athens. We're going back to 8 BC to 4 AD, right? Again, more nonsense. Because there's absolutely no way of verifying that, right? In fact, there's no way of verifying that we were even around then, never mind that they had a nice athletics event. Right? But, you know, the Olympics, just like all the other sporting things, were invented in the 19th century or the 1800s, just like all the other stuff, like football, like everything else. Yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. And here's another fun fact. We like to rid ourselves in the history books of the naughty regimes that were in power with a small p in the past century or so. One of them, of course, one of the main ones being Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler, who was Austrian, not German, and all that sort of stuff. Well, here's another interesting fact. You know, they made a big thing of the Olympic flame being handed around from village to village all throughout the United Kingdom. Well, when the Olympics were here in 2012 in London, they did a whole big spiel where basically the Olympic flame went all around the country. They left no village unturned, and people went out and made a day of it. And there were lots of events and garden fetes and goodness knows what else celebrating the Olympic torch being handed around the country. Well, the whole Olympic flame thing has its roots in the German Olympics of 1936 in Berlin. It was the first time that a flame was ever lit and used to signify the burning flame of Olympiad. And, you know, if the flame ever gets extinguished, then we're all going to die, kind of thing. Well, that's where it comes from. The whole Olympic flame thing came from the Berlin Olympics of 1936. You know, the very country and the very system and the very naughtiness that we all teach our kids about. You know, how people grass their neighbours up if they were Jewish. And, well, we heard that before, grassing neighbours up. You know, and pointing fingers at people for being different. Well, we heard that before. And this, that and the other. Well, nope, I'm afraid, you know, every time you watch the Olympics or you watch some guy or girl or lots in between, of course, you know, I don't want to misgender the carrier of that torch, but you know, when they lean over and light that little fluff, that fire, that flame that then turns into whatever it is they've thought up this time around, well, that has its origins in the Berlin Olympics of 1936, when Adolf and his mates were there in their uniforms, watching on as American black athletes were winning gold medals. What a handy narrative, eh? What a handy narrative. But there we go. So I thought I would just add that in there as a little side trivia. Thought it was quite interesting. So that was 1936, and of course we had no Olympics in 1940 or in 44, and then the next Olympiad that appeared was 1948, after World War II, when people weren't allowed more than a cup of sugar a week in England, and rationing was at its highest, and everyone was malnourished, etc, etc, etc. We had the Olympics in London in 1948 in a place called Wembley Stadium, and a few surrounding venues as well. Isn't that interesting? So there we have it. So I've just decided to walk down a side street away from a place called Eastcliff, which is behind me now. Yeah, so I didn't want to go off on a tangent too much there about the whole being looked at and followed thing, but I just find it quite interesting that that was the case. I noticed it very starkly today. I find it a bit bizarre. And honestly, I'm not that sort of person. I am not the person who looks over his shoulders all the time. I don't regard myself as even slightly important enough to be, you know, to feel like I should be have people keeping tabs on me or anything like that, because I'm not saying anything wrong. I'm just purely, you know, talking about my observations and conclusions I personally have drawn on things that I've witnessed or see, and all the rest of it. And if it doesn't, let's say, fall in line with other people's opinions on stuff, well, then that's all right. But that's it, really. You know, as far as I'm concerned. Well, there we go. So I thought I would just mention that to you. I think I said what I wanted to say in terms of my story in Georgia. I thought it was an interesting story because it's true for a kickoff. I still have my passport from then, actually, with all my visas and stamps and stuff that I had to get to cross the border for them to allow me over the border from Georgia to Turkey, you know, across an imaginary line drawn up by man and woman, and anything in between, you know, to tell us we can live there but we can't live there, we can move here freely but we can't move there freely, and all that nonsense that everybody goes along with. Yeah, but of course, you know, the moral of that story is not all that glitters is gold, you know. Not all what you see appears, or what you appear to see is as it appears, you know. And just because your news outlets or whoever are blurting stuff out does not mean at all, not by a long shot, that that is actually truly going on. And that could be any narrative, it could be any backstory. Just bear that in mind for things upcoming, because there are slowly other narratives creeping in, slowly but surely, that people are going to have to, you know, be aware of and use their discernment, I would hope, and use their experience, I would hope, and not make the same mistakes in terms of their decision making and all the rest of it, because, you know, that's not what we want, is it? So there we go. I've just come out at a church called St Swithin's, and across here is St Swithin's roundabout. So I'm going to turn left and head on home. I'm starting to feel a little bit peckish, so I need to eat as well. But yeah, I just thought I'd have a little walk and a talk and mention those few bits with you, and that story of my time in Georgia and how it coincided with the so-called alleged attack and invasion of the Russians, whilst watching comfortably at home the opening ceremony of the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing. Okie dokie. Gorgeous church this, by the way. Large church. Half of it goes very deep underground. In fact, more than half of it, of course. We know that. But I won't go there now. Yeah, so I thought I would just bring that to you. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and have an enjoyable, serene one. And yeah, I will see you all soon. Some of you sooner. Take it easy. Speak to you then. All the best. And ta-ta for now.